everybody, and welcome to a new episode of the Future of Podcast. Today, I have a very special guest, and actually a returning guest. And given what's going on in the world, given the topic that he is very familiar with and advises a lot of organizations, governments, and executives on, I think it's a very topical one and one that we can get into. Today, I have Gerald Butts. He's the vice chairman of the Eurasia Group, and he works closely to provide a lot of strategic advice, initiatives across the globe for various leaders, like I said, organizations and groups. You may know him from Canadian politics as well. He was a principal secretary to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He was the CEO of the World Wildlife Fund, and also spent quite a bit of time supporting and advising the former Premier of Ontario, Dalton McGuinty. So Gerald, or as we also call you, Jerry, welcome today. And pardon?
It's good to be back. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much. And today's episode is really going to focus on the future of climate change, but maybe with a little bit of a topic focused on geopolitics, which I think is quite topical. But maybe just to start off, Jerry, I know you and I had this conversation about a year ago. We really built it around the future of climate change. At the time, if I remember, I think it was summertime. It was the backdrop of the fires in France. We had a major European heat wave. Since then, we've seen quite a lot of changes, not only in terms of climate. I know in Canada, we've seen major wildfires. We are now witnessing another sort of geopolitical shift in terms of turmoil within the Middle East. And so given all of this, I know back then our conversation was really built around a tone of optimism. And maybe to kick that off, like, would you still maintain that optimism, or is that a different really feeling for you? And then not only just you, maybe just in general, in terms of the tone or the mood of what's going on globally and geopolitically within the world.
Well, I think if I remember correctly, Vasi, and thanks again for having me. It's a pleasure to be here again. I often describe myself as a skeptical optimist, that okay. I think that there's a lot to be optimistic about in the mid to long term when it comes to climate change. But the hard truth of climate change, maybe the most pernicious fact of climate change, is that we've already baked enough of it into the atmosphere to materially change our environment for probably most of our lives. And as a consequence of both that and not being prepared for dealing with those changes, we're going to have a lot of disruption. And there are a lot of people who are, I think, naively hopeful that the energy transition, for instance, is going to be a smooth one and that there will be a soft landing, so to speak. But the analogy I like to use with people is we're giving the global economy a dialysis operation, right? Energy is sort of the bloodstream of the way of how the economy works, and we're changing out old blood for new blood, and we expect that patient to do things like fight wars at the same time, and it's not going so well. So I think it's the people who are concerned about the short term should be, and the people who are surprised by the amount of disruption we're feeling in the geopolitical firmament shouldn't be so surprised, because it's been a long time coming.
Interesting. So I was wondering, maybe if you, like, just for our listeners, in the context of climate change, because we're really trying to tie it to this idea of geopolitics, maybe a quick sort of understanding of like the notion of geopolitics, why it's important in the context of climate change, and really help to kind of frame that. And then I think from there, like to your point, there are all these different sort of perspectives to it. Global balance, there's the energy transition, and that maybe we can get into some of those areas with you.
Yeah, sure, no problem. I think the simplest way to understand the easiest way to understand it is to start with energy, because climate change is really an energy problem. And energy is one of the most politically determined commodities in the world. And that's both from the context of, both in the sense that it's supply managed, as your Canadian listeners would know what that means. Mm-hmm. We talk about the dairy industry in Canada being supply managed. Well, the oil industry globally is supply managed by OPEC. And that means by nature, it's not a free market. It's a politically and policy determined commodity, both in supply and therefore in price. So it's always been subject to politics. I often say to my clients that there is never been any such thing as an unsubsidized electron created or kilojoule burned. And we have the energy system we have largely because of the geopolitical outcome of the Second World War and the predominance of Western democracies through the course of the Industrial Revolution. That's why we have the energy system we have now. It's a subject of policy choices, and that the winners got to make the rules, and these are the rules we made. It stands to reason, therefore, that the next energy system, the one that replaces it, which I think people can be justifiably hopeful will be decarbonized, will be a lot cleaner. It also will be politically determined. So, for instance, the Chinese, who lead the world in renewable energy of all kinds, dominate the supply chains that create the raw materials for everything from solar panels to windmills to battery technology to EVs. That didn't happen by accident. It's not like the Chinese just one day woke up and had all of these strategic instruments at their disposal. They've been building this advantage strategically for the last 10, 15, almost 20 years now. And in a way, your American listeners and my American colleagues find this a provocative statement, but I think it's true. The IRA, the Biden administration's signature climate policy, is really an American version of a 5-year plan, right? That they have decided that the Chinese are too far ahead, that this has all kinds of national security dimensions associated with it, because there's obviously a great amount of geopolitical power that flows to use a bad pun, flows to the people at the apex predators of a dominant global energy system. They woke up and realized that the Chinese were too far ahead and that the free market wasn't going to help them catch up, so that they had to create this policy that would facilitate them doing that. And then, of course, now those two things are coming into conflict with one another. And that's what we mean when we say that geopolitics determines the pace of the energy transition.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's a really good description. And so we know you talk about this transition sort of from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And I think in the last podcast, we talked about it requiring very sort of specific tools, right? So you have like regulations, you've got company frameworks, you need agreements at both global and regional. There's this sense that you really need this, to your point, political will. Like it's a combination of kind of all these things to tackle climate change. But I guess the situation in terms of the energy transition we're faced in is that we've got a bit of an energy crunch, right? So profits continue to increase. How do you manage that transition versus what's going on sort of economically and geopolitically? That, what would you say, given sort of the global current situation, are tangible things that can be done in this scenario sort of moving forward, or maybe where we're at today?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things I'd pick up on there, Vasi. The first is that the direction of travel for the energy transition is set. It's the global energy economy is decarbonizing faster than even its most passionate advocates would have believed it could 10 years ago. And that's a function of three things in descending order of importance, in my view. The price of renewable energy and how it has collapsed over the past 10 years, depending on how you look at it and what jurisdiction. The cost of wind and solar power is something like 10% or 5%, depending on where, of what it was in 2010, right? That's a huge thing, right? Whereas if you look at the cost of power generated by fossil fuels, it's pretty much remained stagnant. And the cost of transportation fuels looks like a jigsaw through that period. And listeners will no doubt, as much as none of us want to think about it, remember the beginning of the pandemic when there was in fact a negative price for oil in a lot of parts of it. So we've gone as low as less than zero and as high as $120 a barrel in the last 2 years. My view is that that's closer to the norm of what the energy transition is going to look like than a stable equilibrium where the oil price fluctuates between $15 to $20 a barrel on either side. We're going to see big run-ups in price, and we're going to see the price collapse because the logic of the energy transition is that, and oil companies themselves are reflecting this logic in their capital expenditures, right? Oil companies no longer invest in the future of oil. They are currently taking the equity in their companies and largely distributing that equity to their existing shareholders. And they're doing share buybacks and dividend increases to maintain a pace of investment on an annual basis. But there's no super major in the world that is betting on oil being produced at the clip that it's currently being produced in 2030, 2035, or 2040. So what does that all mean if you're just a regular person trying to navigate this? It means that the energy system that you rely on is going to get more expensive and more unreliable until it's replaced by the new decarbonized energy system. And lucky for us, we happen to be alive in the transition period. Transitions like this are never smooth. They're always unpredictable. Anytime you're replacing one extraordinarily complex system with another, the unexpected is going to happen. That's just math and logic. So when you're talking about something that is politically charged like energy, it also means that you're going to have kinetic disruptions that are going to manifest themselves in domestically political turmoil, the rise of populism, that sort of thing. And geopolitically, the states that currently hold apex positions in the current energy system are going to fight to keep them. I'm sure you have lots of smart viewers who watched Oppenheimer over the summer.
Yes. Great movie, by the way.
Awesome movie. Yeah. Awesome movie. One of my favorite movies the last 10 years. The amazing thing that those physicists from Niels Bohr to Oppenheimer figured out was how to pull apart the strongest force in the universe, right? Which is the binding force that keeps an atom together. The subatomic force that keeps an atom together. And the political equivalent of that is the inertial power of the status quo, right? And that status quo only gets overwhelmed when a larger force acts upon it, or it disintegrates or decays internally. And there's no doubt in my mind that the stable equilibrium we've enjoyed in a global energy system over the past, call it the post-war period, but you can make an argument it's really been since the turn of the last century, is being overwhelmed by climate change. And the question is, there's no question in my view that climate change is a strong enough power to overwhelm it. The question is the pace at which it happens, right? And it's going to be really messy. It's been messy so far, and it's going to keep being messy.
Yeah, and so like the takeaway then for me, or I guess maybe for listeners, is that this transition will happen. Right. It's happening whether we like it or not. Like that, the inertia is there. We're all moving sort of towards it. Yeah. The pace won't change, but essentially the journey and sort of the geopolitical lens, or I guess the landscape in which we'll be operating, that will be bumpy. So regardless of what that sort of, whatever's happening now, it could be very messy. We have this crazy variance of oil that, you're right, at the beginning of the pandemic, I remember as a Canadian, I'm paying like 60 cents. Now I'm paying, $1.20. Don't quote me on what it is. But so that really is, whether we like it or not, the transition's going to happen. It's just, in your mind, it's going to be very messy and very difficult for us to sort of navigate.
That's right. And the only thing I'd quibble with what you said is I actually don't think that the timeline is determined.
Okay.
That it could be, and I only say that reflecting my own 25 years working in this field in different capacities, that had you told me in 2010 that solar power would be cheaper everywhere than gas-fired electricity by the first 2 decades of the 2020s, I would have said, that's crazy. Awesome if it happens, but it's crazy. And here we are. It's happened. So I think that the timeline is definitely, it's an issue because this is the hardest thing for people to wrap their minds around when it comes to change, is the stock and flow problem, right? We continuously get bombarded with news items and information about how much we're emitting this year, right? And how that relates to last year. But the worst part of climate emissions is that they persist in the atmosphere absent any technology to remove them for hundreds of years. So think about it this way. In the last, there's just over 2 trillion tons of carbon in the atmosphere that shouldn't be there, right? Think about that. For 2 trillion tons, that's a big number. And about 75% of that has been emitted since 1998. Just think about that for a second.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. I don't even know that stat. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And it's the hard thing about climate change. I probably said this last time I was on your podcast, but people treat it like it's a political issue. It's not. It's physics, chemistry, and math, and it doesn't lie. So, every single ton of emissions we avoid is a good thing, and every single unnecessary ton of emissions we put in the atmosphere is a bad thing. So even if we stopped emitting now, we've already got enough poison in the atmosphere to change the climate. But it really matters how quickly we come down off this peak. Like, most people think emissions have around peaked within a rounding error. Some people say it was last year. Some people say it'll be next year. Some people say it will be 2027. But again, the direction of travel is set. But it really matters how quickly we come off that peak, because, as I said, every ton we avoid is an unalloyed good for the planet.
Yeah. And would that be the same, similar to just your overall transition message? That would be the same with electric vehicles, right? Because one of the things I've seen lately in the news, you obviously, this is something that you look at. You've seen a lot of executives saying, we don't know if we'll meet our targets. This transition is going to be so much harder. Maybe there isn't a consumer appetite to make that transition. But what would you say to that? The same thing. It's like, whether we like it or not, that transition is happening, regardless of all of these sort of major events that are happening, and almost forget about what we're reading in the news. And it's, this is all part of the long game. Yeah, well, that's a really interesting example, because, of course, the electric vehicle transition is one of 4 or 5 really big macro things that will have a material impact on global emissions. It's about 25% of emissions, right? Globally. That's a big number. That's the same as China, right? So that's a big number. And there are a couple of things that's worth going into this in some detail. My immediate reaction when I hear the CEOs of the American, or Stellantis is more Italian than American, but the Western OEMs, my wife grew up in Windsor, Ontario, so I know this is near and dear to many people's heart in this country. And her dad worked on the line at Ford's for 35 years, right? The 3 formerly known as big, the Ford, GM, and Chrysler. GM, Ford, and Chrysler. Yeah, GM, Ford, Chrysler. Yeah. So if I heard the CEOs of those companies, if I were an asset allocator, if I were an investor that focused on global automotive investment, I would be more worried about those companies than I would be worried about the emissions profile of the industry more broadly. Because a couple of things have happened in the past 10 years that North America, I mention this stat all the time in presentations, and people have no idea that it has happened. Last year, China passed Germany and Japan to become the world's largest exporter of automobiles. 10 years ago, Indonesia made more cars than China. And they stood that industry up from scratch. They created it ex nihilo in 10 years, largely as a function of the policy program that you and I just talked about. So now, while the Americans are struggling to get their supply chain up and running
to create domestic electric vehicles, 6 out of every 10 electric vehicles in the world are in China. So if you assume that we are going to deal with climate change and that electric vehicles are going to be a big part of how we're going to deal with climate change, and they're not a silver bullet, but they're a big part of it, then I'd be really worried if I were an American car company and couldn't figure this out. So the announcements have a lot more to do with, and keep in mind the other element to think about here is that China is now by far the largest car market in the world. So, globally, commodities gravitate to where their growth markets are. That's just the way the world works. And the United States automakers have had such global policy setting power because they were the chief suppliers to the largest market in the world for 60 years. And now they no longer are. So this is a big change. And there are going to be winners and losers. And the winners and losers are not going to be very predictable. It's reminiscent of the birth of the automobile in the first place. Most people know this, but Daimler invented the internal combustion engine in Germany in the 1880s, I think, maybe 1870s. But it wasn't really until Henry Ford built the Model T based on revolutionizing manufacturing that it became a commercially viable product. So the Americans took technology invented elsewhere and figured out how to mass produce it at scale in a way that made money per unit cost. Stop me when you've heard this story.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
This is exactly what's happening in China.
Yeah. No, and so what I'm hearing or taking away essentially is whether we like it or not, this is a competitive space. It depends on who those players are, within the global landscape. That'll change and jockey. I mean, you also see that we don't need to get into this with Tesla as well, right? For first in space may not necessarily remain there, depending on factors and so forth.
Tesla's a good example. Fundamentally, Tesla is a Chinese car company.
Yeah.
That's where they make the cars. It's where they get their resources. It's where they employ their people. Yeah. Tesla is a Chinese car company.
Yeah. And I think with a lot of things, this, Jerry, when it comes to just fundamental change, it's like, how do we pull together that gap between where we are now behaviorally as a society, where that pace of change is, and then how do we kind of bridge the gap between the two? And, I think when it comes to this, it's really about, we may be all at different points of a journey, depending on the region and sort of the global power or whatever that, company is. But at some point we're going to get there because there's no choice, right?
Yeah. And think of it this way. It's in my view, it's less about the overcoming habits and behaviors of Western consumers and more about creating products and services that will achieve price competitiveness at scale, right? And the Chinese China has a lot of problems. I'm not one of those people who thinks that China is going to rule the world automatically. I don't think that's happening, actually. I would not bet against the American economy in the long run at all. And I think that the amount of change that they've been able to generate in that system in a short period of time with one piece of federal legislation, albeit a very large one with a lot of money attached to it, the IRA, is just indicative of how quickly the US can change when it needs to. My point is that it's that competition that's going to drive the pace of the energy transition now more than Greta Thunberg or Greenpeace.
Yeah, that's fair. And I think what we'll be witnessing is that jockeying of that competition and ultimately who wins in the end, really, if you think about it. Yeah. So maybe a bit of a shift. I know in terms of like global balance and kind of like what's going on globally. I know, I looked at your firm, the Eurasia Group always does those, annual global risks. Yeah, I love reading that. I know one of the risks was that a very small sort of group of individuals politically have amassed a lot of power when it comes to sort of issues. From that, you get a lot of political consequences, right? And so you have like you mean to get into it, the Russias and the Chinas, the Irans, all of these different powers regionally. And maybe the alignment, I would say, on climate change isn't always there amongst these different sort of, power bases, or you could probably be way more articulate than I am. So what would you say to how do we, from that geopolitical kind of power-based perspective, do we really tackle, and it's very broad, I guess, this idea of climate change? Because that power is very different when you and I look at it through a Western lens versus other parts of the world. But we know that it all has to sort of work somehow, and there has to be alignment and agreement in certain areas for us to be like, how do we tackle something as big as climate change and the pieces of it geopolitically?
Yeah, I'm not sure, honestly, we need much more alignment than we currently have. I think it would be nice if climate change were a cooperative thing where we all got together and said we're all going to do the same thing at the same time at the same pace, and therefore we drove emissions to zero in the next 5 years. I just think that's politically naive. That's not the way the world works. It's not the way it's ever worked, and it's not the way it's going to work on this. That said, when people get really down about the state of international cooperation as it relates to climate change, I often say that there's only one thing we as a species have agreed to do together this century, and that's the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement has a lot of detractors, but it's also driven a lot of positive momentum in the efforts to decarbonize everywhere. So it is true that Russia doesn't want to decarbonize because the Russian economy is basically a gas station with nuclear weapons and some fertilizer. But it's even more true that China probably does want to decarbonize, and so does the United States, and so does Western Europe, and so does the global South. They just don't want to be further impoverished by it. The preponderance of momentum is really strong. If there's a geopolitical fissure, it's between, and I hate this term because it doesn't really mean anything, but it conjures up something useful in some people's minds, the fissure between the global South and the wealthy part of the world. You'll see this on full display at COP28 in the United Arab Emirates, that the poorer countries of the world, which a lot of them being equatorial and densely populated, are going to face the most significant downside from climate change, are all saying to the rest of the world, we didn't create this problem and we're going to suffer the consequences of it. And now you're expecting us to halt our development. We're just trying to develop the same way you guys did. That's not fair. And I see that point, right? It's a good point. But it also, the atmosphere doesn't care. So it's a strong short-term ethical argument. But the only way around it is if we figure out a way for the companies and firms that have capital to invest in the global South, to make sure that they don't have to use fossil fuels to go through the development arc that Western countries did in the last 100 years. So I wish there were a lot more. If there's one downside of the current geopolitical disruption, is that there's no cooperation between North and South.
Okay, and then so I'm wearing sort of my political science hat, because I remember when I studied sort of political theory, all the rage was this notion of globalization, right? So it's like this spread of the flow of financial products, goods, technology, agreements, and all of that. And I think, over the last few years, we've really shifted. Things have become either more regional, I guess, this notion of sort of populism and so forth. With that shift, based on what you said in terms of, how do we bridge the north to the south? Like, how do you think that all plays out when it comes to really tackling some of these issues?
I think That's a really good question. I think that what is the great line? Reports of my death have been gradually greatly exaggerated. I think the reports of globalization's sudden death have been exaggerated. Decoupling, deglobalization, de-risking, whatever you want to call it. It hasn't happened yet, right? And it may, and it's certainly true that capital outflows from China have increased, FDI has decreased, and I would say the state of capital flow in and out of China is the best proxy for how globalization is. If globalization had a fever, that would be the thermometer, right? And I think we are seeing the leading edge of that. But I also don't think, given the complexity of how complexly intermeshed the Western and Chinese supply chains are, I don't think the process of decoupling those two things is going to be as swift and smooth as your average op-ed writer in a Western newspaper thinks it's going to be. That it involves literally millions of decisions every day by private and public sector actors to either invest or not invest, to build a company or not build a company, where to do it, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't see it as happening very quickly or very smoothly. And I think it's a sucker's game to predict what the next stable equilibrium would look like. My firm's founder, Ian Bremer, coined this term to describe this period we're going through about 15 years ago now, called the G0, right? That we're now living in a world where the geopolitical institutions set up in the aftermath of post-World War to govern the world, post-World War II, no longer have any authority or legitimacy with most of the world's population. And they haven't been replaced by anything yet. So that vacuum is, lucky for us, the time period we get to live through.
Yeah, that's fair.
So that's a long-winded way, Vassie, of saying I think it's impossible to predict how this lands.
Yeah, that's fair. And then you also touched upon a little bit. We actually touched upon this last podcast too. This idea of sort of, I think when we chatted, it was sort of about a few months into the war between Ukraine and Russia as well. Yeah. And I always feel like, me personally, and again, media is a lens in which, whatever we read is what we're given, but we don't really always talk about this idea of food security and people security in the context of climate change. Yeah. And we know that, things like a war in the Ukraine, the pandemic, these spur major sort of supply chain issues. How do you get certain commodities to people across the world? When we have major climate change events, you basically set up examples where there could be large migratory patterns and so forth of people. Yeah. So like when you think of like the geopolitics of climate change, like I guess very broadly, like how do we put more of a focus on that sort of food people perspective? Like what are those impacts and like what can we do sort of moving forward? We have examples like major wildfires in Canada, major sort of environmental cataclysmic events. And I think sometimes we always forget about that, especially from a geopolitical perspective, that, human element of it and really sort of that food security or commodity security perspective of it.
Oh, well, I mean, I think that, first of all, I think that's an excellent point. I think we talk too much in very macro terms when we talk about climate change, when the way most people experience climate change is in either food or water shortage or unbearable weather conditions. I think the global media has done a pretty good job of focusing on the spectacular events like wildfires and the sky turning orange in New York City because of wildfires in the far north of Quebec. But, I've got a bunch of stats that are jumping to my head now, but just to give you one that I think makes the point you're making. The International Energy Agency says that due to the pandemic and the run up in the cost of energy conventional energy created by the pandemic. There were 70 million Africans that converted back to a local biomass source of fuel. So think about that for a second. That's peat moss, that's bushes, that's, whatever's around you. There were 70 million people who decided that it's waste, that they were just going to burn what was near them because the energy supply was so expensive that they couldn't afford to buy it. That's an incredible number. That's twice the population of Canada almost. And stuff like that's going to happen, right? I personally think that the most underrated consequence of climate change is water. And you're seeing that in the Western United States, although they had a good season, which has lulled everybody back to sleep. At long-term, California has got big problems. So does the Southwestern desert. And in other places, like the biblical floods that you saw in Pakistan last year, it's going to present itself that way. And in some places, it's going to be both in sequence, right? You're going to have long droughts followed by an incredible dump of moisture from the atmosphere, from atmospheric rivers and lakes that we've never really seen before. So, it all is going to take some time to adjust to.
Yeah. Do you think we're like globally prepared?
No.
For some of this? Okay.
Not even close. Yeah. I mean, we're not even prepared in rich countries.
Yeah.
Right. You think about the flood that happened in Hamburg. Was it Hamburg? It was northwestern Germany a couple of years ago. It happened to coincide with the German election. And there were 500-600-year-old towns that were just overrun, never had been before. The French are having trouble finding enough water to run their nuclear power plants. And this stuff is all, when you think about how complex and how utterly 100% reliant we are on a stable climate to run the economy, to keep politics stable, to grow our food, to get our water, it stands to reason that a macro level change, that we as a species are living in a climate we've never lived in before, is going to cause all kinds of disruptions, small and large, in the billions every year. So the weather isn't what it used to be, Vassie.
No, I know. I'm living it here in Hamilton, so yeah. I'm fully aware. I wanted to get back to maybe, Jerry, 2 questions from last year to sort of follow up. So one of the questions you and I talked about last year was, what can I, as an individual, Vassie Papadopoulos, do to support climate change? Your response, and I loved it. It was, voting in the right governments that can lead on this. And I thought about this, and I guess the follow-up for that is, in the case where it's hard to vote and to sort of change the trajectory of maybe certain governments in the world, like how would you respond to that? Like maybe that works in a Western democracy like Canada, but maybe that sort of ballot change may be different in other parts of the world. And do you still think that's the best way for us as humans, to really influence the trajectory of climate change? Yeah,
for sure. There's no doubt in my mind that the most valuable thing individual humans have at their disposal to affect the course of climate change is their vote, where they can vote. That is absolutely true. And there are a lot of places where human beings don't have that option. And in that case, it's to get involved in your community. It's to buy, all this stuff is a rounding error, but it's to buy more responsible products, to send market signals to the manufacturers of goods and services that you expect them to be low carbon. There's a comprehensive suite of things you can do, and it's not really my kind of bailiwick, but there's lots of stuff online that people can find if they want to lower their own carbon footprint. My point when people raise carbon footprint is, let's just remember that there's no individual choice that is going to solve climate change, that this is a market failure and a systemic problem, and it's not going to be solved through individual personal virtue choices.
And then I guess the last one, maybe not so much as, tied back to the previous question, but generally speaking, do you think the notion of climate change, and especially in a geopolitical context, has a communications problem? Like, do you think it's something very difficult for the average person to really comprehend and understand, and feel like what role can they play in that if, there are things from a technical, scientific perspective, political perspective, for us to understand about how to tackle this moving forward?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that in general, in most places, and this is reflected in polling, the public is far ahead of their political leaders. The challenge is, and this gets back to something I said earlier, the challenge is the inertial force of the status quo is maintained by people and organizations, largely firms and largely fossil fuel companies, that benefit enormously from that status quo stability. So it's not so much that it's a hard problem to communicate and that the solutions are hard to communicate. It's that they're really good communicators, really well-financed communicators who are on the other side, who are vested in maintaining status quo. And they don't always play by the Marquess of Queensberry rules.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. I guess to wrap up, we always like to ask our, okay, anyways, so Jerry, just to wrap up, I always like to close out with 2 questions. I think we did this last time. A really good book you're reading, and maybe a good show or movie that you would also recommend to our listeners.
Well, we already mentioned the movie that's my dog.
Oh my God.
You also had to make a guest appearance before the end of the show.
Okay, ready? I know. Sure.
No, leave her in.
Wait, Bianca? Is that
Bianca?
the yeah, there we go. All right.
Yeah, she's named after Bianca Andreescu, the Canadian tennis player.
Oh, that I didn't know. Okay. Yeah. All right, I'll take all of this out. Okay, so
no, you should leave her in. Leave Bianca in.
Leave Bianca in. All right.
So the movie I've already mentioned, Oppenheimer, I loved it. I thought it was amazing. Cillian Murphy he's amazing. But everybody in it's great. So I would highly recommend that. And if you still can, go see it in a theater. And then book, I'm going to be very Canadian. I'm reading someone I've been reading my whole life, but I haven't read in a few years. And that's Alice Munro. And I am enjoying I'm just kind of reading a selection of her stories that were compiled a few years ago I think it's called Alice's Best or something. And it's got a great introductory essay by Margaret Atwood. So I would highly recommend it. It's just some of the best stuff ever written in the language. The only Canadian to win a Nobel Prize in Literature.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for listening. Today, our episode was the future of climate change and geopolitics.